in this little scene we have 4 different paintings, and the question I want to answer today is, why does this one look so flustered and boring and difficult when these ones have so much light and life in them? And if you don't know why, or you haven't heard of watercolour layering, then this video is really important. It's really important to help you understand how watercolours work and how to avoid this and how to move closer towards a light, airy, transparent style. We're going to be painting some really lovely little watercolour scenes on these postcards. These are watercolour postcards by hand Muller, and on these we will create some layered paintings. Layered paintings using the amazing layering properties of watercolours. Apart from a little bit of watercolour paper, you'll just need a brush or two. I've got some smaller brushes today and a little selection of watercolours. And then you're ready to go and learn a little bit about layering your watercolours. What I see happening far too often in watercolours is something like this. So this is what not to do. You're painting with quite thick paint. You can see it's very dark, deep blue paint. And this is your first watercolours you're putting on the page. The page isn't wet, it's very dry. So all the watercolours are staying where they are and getting a sort of grainy odd texture. And we've also painted around our tree. This is a tree scene, but we've left white space everywhere we want the tree, which seems to make sense, but it doesn't. When we come and try and add our tree in, what we find is we leave white spaces everywhere. We want that light to shine through the tree, but instead of getting a lovely blue sky behind the tree, and instead of everything sort of blending together, we have this feeling of the tree being separate or stuck on, and everything just doesn't really work. It's all busy, it's all flustered, and actually it's a lot of hard work. It really isn't as easy as it could be. Instead of making them difficult, forgive me while I show you a really quick sped up version of an easy way to paint before we take you step by step through this same painting process. Here I've made the paper wet, that's optional, but it does help create these loose and transparent watercolours. This gives you a really fluid background. And notice how I've painted the entire background. We can layer on top of that background to add our details. Here I'm building a sort of slightly abstract rocky landscape, and if you know me, you know what's coming next. That's right, obviously we have a lighthouse on top. But see how this layer, this lighthouse, is just a little bit thicker, a little bit darker, and now it sits on top of the sky. There was no need for me to paint around it, no need for me to make it difficult. And this whole painting took only a few minutes. I've sped it up, but I've not sped it up a huge amount. And that's how easy it can be. Now what we're going to do is do this whole process. We'll actually do 3 layers, and we'll take it a little bit slower so that you can feel really confident in producing this effect yourself. So what we're going to be demonstrating today with our sketching is the idea that as you paint, you make your paint thicker, and each layer of paint layers on top of the other one, producing a beautiful effect. And this is something which you should incorporate into all of your watercolour painting, but it's a really good thing to practice in little studies like this. So we're going to start off with one of our bigger brushes. I've got a 1/2 inch flat brush here, and we're going to paint a lovely sort of soft sky. So I'm going to get a little bit of ultramarine blue, mix that in my palette, and what we want for our first layer, remember this is about layering, we want a nice and watery thin paint. And I'm just going to paint on, well, I probably want a little bit more than that, a little bit richer than that. And then we're going to paint that on and try and create a nice graduated wash. So we come down and we create a sort of soft and gentle wash coming down the page. We're imagining here that we're painting a scene. So as we come down, we'll add a bit more water. Maybe we'll change to adding a bit of lavender, or you could use a bit of cerulean blue. And we're going to get this gradual change from a deep blue sky coming perhaps down towards a horizon line. Perhaps this is where the land is about to meet us. And then as we get there, we can pop a little bit of green down. So here's our sort of land where it meets our sky. And we just use 2 or 3 different pigments here. We can branch out a bit. Let's pop a little bit of yellow even at the front. And look, now we've got our really graduated layer of watercolour. If we want to make this a little bit more interesting, we could sort of pop in a little bit of wet on wet painting. I've got lots of videos about wet on wet paintings. You can check those out on my channel as well if you want to know more about that. We can pop in a few of these sort of little shapes from that. Maybe a little bit of extra green in there as well with a little bit of wet on wet painting. But what's important about this is all the first layer. The page is all wet, so all of these bits we've just added are going to become very soft and gradual in the background. So what we're going to do now is just let this dry. It'll be a few minutes and we'll come back and see what happens when we start layering our painting. So we are back and we are nice and dry, and you can see we've got this full layer of paint coming all the way down. It's got this gradual change and there are no hard lines in it. What we need to know about watercolours is that they are additive. When you layer them, you can see the layer below. So every layer becomes darker and darker. That means as we paint, we want to paint smaller and smaller areas, always leaving some of that lovely light in behind. I'm going to move, I picked up a very small brush there, but I'm actually going to change. I'm going to pick up a size 6 round this time, just a size 6 round brush. I'm going to use the same pigments. I've got my green again. This could be a sap green. It happens to be a green apatite genuine, but it could be any green. And we're going to just work on the elements we'd expect to be darker or more obvious. So here we've got a foreground, haven't we? We've got a foreground of where we'd expect to see some nice dark grass. We're painting with thicker paint. Notice how this is less watery than our blue up there. And we're just painting a nice sort of more obvious layer. Do you see how this is now much darker? It is layered up, it is increased in opacity. Above our little layer of grass, I'll just keep my brushes under control, we'll pop some little bushes in, little shapes of green. And these will gradually soften into this little layer of grass at the front. And we could again explore a little bit, maybe we use some yellow to just change things up, to have a little bit of variety going on. But in a simple study like this, what we want to do is not overcomplicate things. We just want really simple touches. Maybe a few little marks for some grass jumping up at the top. And then the sort of final touch, the final little bit, will be a little tree emerging. And here I'm going to use a dark colour to start with. So I'm going to use a bit of indigo, which is a blue. And we're going to keep it fairly watery because this has got a high inherent darkness. We just need a little bit. And we'll pick a spot just off to the centre and we'll find a little sort of trunk coming up like so. And then little marks to create our tree shape. Remember to leave a little bit of light coming through. You can always see some of that light coming through. And as I said, this is an additive process. So every layer we paint is going to be darker than the one before. If we cover this whole area with our tree shapes, we're going to lose a whole sort of, well, a whole sense of light and sort of fun coming through from that first lovely soft layer. Instead, what we do, we just paint a few little shapes, a few little leaf shapes emerging from the outside. We could even have a bit of fun and pop some sort of birds floating off here. Little just painting little M shapes really. Makes them a little bit darker, just a tiny careful touch in there. And then maybe, again, to add that little bit of variety, while things are still wet, we can touch in some little bits of green. And this will blend into this layer. And see how that blue becomes a bluey green now. A little bluey green, and very gentle and lovely with it. And now our second layer is done. You can see that there's a slightly darker feel to it. We're going to let that dry. And predictably, we're going to come back and add another layer. And this time we'll be creating those final touches and that real punch of contrast. Now, one thing to note here is when these watercolours have dried and our second layer is dried, it becomes much less dark. And this is another reason we have to gradually layer up, because as we paint, we're never 100% certain what it's really going to look like at the end. And now we can come back, and I'm going to use a smaller brush again. Before was a size 6, so we're now down to a size 3. And a smaller brush helps the paint become darker. And we're going to be using, this time, very thick paint, so much thicker even than it was a minute ago. And we're just going to be picking a few places to really increase that sort of watercolour darkness, that value. And in doing so, creating this sense of shadows, the sense of sort of shape within our scene. I'm going to start off with this green. This green is, again, quite dark, so we can use it to get that initial feel of shadows. We can almost draw, when we've got a fine brush like this, we can almost draw little shapes. We're less worried now about avoiding hard edges and lines, and we're more worried about actually creating a bit of structure within our image. I often talk about structure in my other videos where we sort of look at using ink to create the same effect, but this time we're using watercolour as a darker layer to create that same effect. I'm now coming in with my indigo, a really dark colour, and with that indigo we can just create even sort of bolder areas. Again, remembering to keep some of that first layer and that second layer showing through. We want to create a layered effect. We don't want to just cover everything. Each layer is adding to the ones before, not covering it, not sort of totally taking away. Into the tree now, we'll get this really thick dark paint. I should move that brush, shouldn't I? We'll get this really thick dark paint, this indigo, and we will find some real sort of points of contrast in our tree. We might want to, again, just concentrate on getting a lot of these shapes of darkness filled in, maybe with a bit of green again, but keeping it thicker, but also making sure some of those background layers are still poking through. Do you see how I'm concentrating a lot of the darkness on this side of the tree as well? By doing that, what I'm hopefully going to suggest is a sense of light coming down from above and shooting this way. We can double down on that by creating a little shadow down here. See a little bit of shadow with much thicker dark paint. Now this tree is both casting a shadow within it and down below it. A little bit more green, and we can even just introduce a few more lines, a few more of those finer details. And as you learn to layer your watercolours, each layer wants to become a little bit more held back, but also a little bit of extra detail. When we did that wet on wet painting at the beginning, there's no real hope of adding much detail. But as we come to layers like this is where we can find loads and loads of detail. If you're feeling brave, you might add a few little splashes at this stage, little bits of green around the tree, for example. Maybe even some little punches of blue into the sky. A little bit of fun, just suggesting something else going on, something we can't add ourselves. It has to come from a little bit of watercolour magic, a little bit of randomness. I'm going to just invest in my birds a little bit more. Do you see how this has gone a bit wrong here? It was too watery. That's not a problem. We just gradually lift out that pigment, and because watercolours can lift when they are wet, we can actually find that even if you make a mistake like that, you'll be able to come back and redo it. Just about taking a measured approach. Sometimes you have to be quick but not rushed. Similarly, I've got a little bit of a bubble falling off the edge there, but that's fine. Adds a bit of something to the composition, and if I was bothered, I could just chop my page down. This came from when I was drying it initially. A little bit of water sort of bled off to the side here. And there you go. Is there anything else we could do? There's always little touches. Maybe here we want little bits of light, just little bits of yellow, punching in around our grass, around the foreground anyway. Maybe little bits of yellow in our tree. Tiny little touches on the top to promote a sort of feeling of light and fun. But really, I think that's our little scene done. Hopefully we've learned a little bit about watercolour layering. And just for a bit of fun, here is a third little scene. Again, I'm starting with a little bit of water in the sky, but I only added water to the top. You don't need to add water all the way, even if you want to create flowing colours. The colours as well can be fun and abstract. Here's a tree which is going to be blue, pink, brown, yellow. It's not a process where you need to be literally copying a reference. You can be inventing things, you can be having fun, and all the while you can be really improving your watercolours. I'd encourage you to just produce a few of these little postcard-like sketches on postcards, on scraps of watercolour paper, in your sketchbook. It's a really fun way to practice your sketching. Don't forget, if you are, you can always share with me. Just tag me at Toby Sketch Loose on Instagram, and I'd love to see you here in the next video to explore more ink and watercolour effects. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.